We are going to talk about the age of exploration, and in the age of exploration in section 1, we're going to understand why these people were willing to sail on a tiny boat around the world, risking their lives. Well, they wanted access to Asia by sea because it is much faster than going over land, and you can carry more things than on the back of a horse. They wanted the economic motives of expansion, trade, and getting into the spice trade. They found precious metals such as silver and gold, and they had religious zeal, which was them trying to spread the Catholic faith to the natives. Spirit of adventure with the hopes of becoming rich, God, glory, and gold. And you can kind of see the timeline down there as we move through this, and you can revisit the PowerPoint inside of this section as well. So religious zeal, explorers such as Hernan Cortez were interested in sharing the Catholic faith with native peoples. Plus, there was an increased desire of grandeur, glory, a spirit of adventure. Finally, people had political ambition to gain land and the title of the New World. Now you can see how this map shows you how people traveled around, where we have them marked, and you can see the Portuguese and the directions that they went over here into India. You could see over here we've got France, and in those areas they still speak French, so that's kind of a hint as to who settled these areas. Spain, you can notice the orangey yellow color going up into these areas and down into here, and who these people are, because their names are actually written on those arrows. So this is some indication of who went where during these spirit of exploration. If you download the PowerPoint, you can also watch these videos. The Portuguese trading empire right here. So Portugal took the lead in European exploration under the leadership of Prince Henri the Navigator. Vasco da Gama sailed round the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. He cut from Portugal down to Africa and across the Indian Ocean to India. In 1498, he sailed into the port of Calcutta, where he took on a cargo of spices. The Portuguese returned to destroy the Muslim fleet and take control of shipping in 1509. From this time on, the Portuguese launched expeditions to China and the Spice Islands. Voyages to the Americas. The Portuguese sailed eastward. The Spanish went westward. Columbus was an Italian that sailed for Spain across the Atlantic. He reached Cuba, October 1492. Thinking he was in India, hence calling them Indians, he took 3 more voyages to try to reach India. Never did. In the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, Spain and Portugal divided the newly discovered lands of Europe between the Portuguese Empire and Spain along the meridian 370. It's kind of funny that they were the ones making these decisions. Continuing in section 1, exploration and expansion, the Spanish conquistadors established an overseas empire in the Americas. In 1519, Hernan Cortez and his Spanish allies were welcomed into the Toltenitzin by the Aztec monarch Montezuma. You might have remembered this when we were looking at this particular topic in the Americas version of the world history class. The Spanish were expelled from the city 1 year later. When the Spaniards left, smallpox devastated the Aztec capital. The Spanish, led by Cortez, returned and captured the city, and the Aztec Empire was destroyed, conquering Mexico. In 1530, Francisco Pizarro led an expedition into the Incan Empire. Like the Aztec, the Incas were no match for the Spanish disease, guns, and horses. Pizarro conquered the Incan Empire and established a new capital for the Spanish colony at Lima, Peru. The Spanish used a system of colonial administration called economía system. The landowners to use Native Americans as laborers. Native American political and social structures were torn apart and replaced by European systems of religion, language, and government. The exchange of plants, animals, and disease between Europeans and the Americas, known as the Columbian Exchange. The economic impact and competition. The conquered and the conquerors were affected by exploration. The Spanish lusted for gold, but also found trade profitable. Plantations were established, raising sugar, cotton, livestock to export to Europe. New foods such as potatoes, cocoa, corn, and tobacco were shipped to Europe as well. And then you guys can see that the smallpox picture down there, of course, this is a video that you'll watch because smallpox was devastating. And at the time, there was no cure. Trade, colonies, and mercantilism. A colony is a settlement of people living in a new territory linked with a parent company by trade. Mercantilism is the economic theory that trade generates wealth and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances, which a government should encourage by means of protectionism. The balance of trade is the difference between what a nation imports, buys, and what a nation sells. Now, a little thing about the slavery. Of course, people wanted slavery because economically, when you don't have to pay for a workforce, your profit margins increase. But unfortunately for the Spanish at the time, the Native Americans that they had enslaved were just running away and knew the land better than the Spanish did, so they just kept leaving. So they had to come up with a different form of free labor. And that's what the Portuguese did, and the Spanish followed suit, and then the English behind them. And you can see where in this slave trade area from Africa those slaves went and ended up. The slave trade, as plantations, large agricultural estates, were established in the Americas, a need for a large labor force increased. These plantations were growing sugar, cotton, and tobacco. As the Native American populations began to die from European diseases, they looked to Africa for a new group of workers. The growth of the slave trade, it's the triangular trade of manufactured goods go to Africa, slaves go to the Americas, raw materials go to Europe. The trip from Africa to the Western Hemisphere was known as the Middle Passage, and of course, many slaves died during that particular journey. We're now going on to section 2 and some of the different things about slavery in the Americas. And what you can see is the cause and effect right there. So the cause is local African rulers view slave trade as an income because they would sell each other into slavery, and that was money for those local people. The demand for labor grew as the sugar cane and cotton and stuff grew in the Americas. Demand for domestic servants in Southwest Asia, and then the demand for domestic servants in Europe. So the effect is that it depopulated African countries. It was taking out a force of people that could no longer increase the population. And then it increased warfare amongst the African people. You can go ahead and look at some of these other things that were facts and myths in the area. We have a lot of things that have been cultivated by Hollywood, and I want to make sure that you always kind of research these different aspects. When you're watching this, you can go ahead and download this video and see the slave triangle if you go to the PowerPoint presentation. Right here in section 2, Africa in the Age of Transition. So what you should do is kind of look at this section, look at the map over here, and you can see these different areas of where the people were taken. So most likely if you are African American, we would pull your DNA, and the majority of you would probably have DNA that would have been found along these areas of Africa. Of course, some of these tribes went into other parts of Africa, stole people and brought them back, and that could change the DNA that you could be carrying. And then right over here on this, you can see who had the most amount of slaves, who was collecting voyages, slaves transported, percent of slaves transported. So if I was to ask you who had the most, you should answer Portugal and Brazil, and then who had the least, and you'd go down here to British North America, Britain. All right, so this is the United States. And so you could see how cultures were carved out between the mixture of French and Africa and all of the people that came together in the New World. Sources of the slave trade prior to the Europeans coming to Africa, most slaves were prisoners of war. The first slaves were brought to Africa and sold to the Europeans for gold, guns, and goods and taken back to Europe. The effects of the slave trade, well, cultures were decimated. As in the case of Benin, where there was a destruction of culture, warfare increased, human sacrifice increased, and populations were destroyed. Political and social structures. Traditional political systems were monarchies that were common form of government in Africa. Some principalities were linked to kinship. Africans played a direct role in the slave trade, selling their captives or prisoners to war in European buyers. The prisoners and captives who were sold were usually from neighboring or enemy ethnic groups. These captive slaves were considered other, but not part of the people of the ethnic group or tribe. African kings held no particular loyalty to them. Sometimes criminals would be sold so that they could no longer commit crimes in the area. Most other slaves were obtained from kidnappings and through raids that occurred at gunpoint through joint ventures with the Europeans. But some African kings refused to sell any of their captives or criminals. You can see a king there, a former slave, refused to do business with slavers completely. So what you can see here is one of the areas you could actually go visit today. How the Americas are linked to Africa. What do you think? Motives and means. The demand for enslaved Africans increased dramatically after Europeans began to settle in the Americas. The Cape of coast of Castell in Ghana is one of the forts where enslaved Africans were held until ships arrived to take them to the Americas. This fort could hold about 1,500 slaves, usually locked in dark, crowded dungeons for many weeks. Today, the Cape Coast Castle contains a museum that allows people to learn about slavery. You can see here the European slave, I'm still on that. It's Europe trade in Southeast Asia. And so what you can see from this are the ports controlled by those particular countries. So you can see down in here, this is colored a purpley color. So we've got the Netherlands. Those blue colors are France. Around India, of course, India is a big area. And then you get up into these areas and you can see who does or does not control things. Here we have Portugal. Spain is in Manila, the Philippines. And obviously they speak Spanish. And there's quite a few Spanish names in the Philippines, surnames. So that stands to reason. Mainland refers to the greater continent of Asia up here and not the islands. This area was somewhat peaceful amongst their people, but there were some upheavals of the Vietnamese and Champa and Mekong Delta from the Khmer. In the Malay Peninsula, Muslims began to penetrate the area due to trade taking over. The arrival of Europeans. The Portuguese seized the area of the Muslims in Malaysia, the Spice Islands, a shift of power. Following the Portuguese came the Dutch, the Netherlands, and the English. The Dutch began to take over the Portuguese settlements by force. The aggressive Dutch traders drove the English traders out of the spice market, leaving them only in Sumatra. The Dutch established the Dutch East India Company. You can see their picture over here to the right. And there's its name, but I'm not even going to try that. To trade in the area, they became more than a trading company. They were a dominant presence in the area of government and trade along the with military strength. Think about the biggest companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, in the world becoming a ruling body of a country. And the impact on the mainland, most of the mainland countries could unite and drive out invading Europeans and only trade with them as they wanted to. They had strong monarchies and could resist foreign intrusion. Religious and political systems, Islam and Christianity were invading religions that came to the predominantly Buddhist and Confucianist countries. Islamic sultans were in the Malay Peninsula. Vietnam kingship followed the Chinese model, leading to the teachings of Confucius. And so you can kind of see when you're in here, you can also watch this video on the Dutch East India Company, trading company. It's pretty fascinating because, like I said, I can give you the examples of Amazon and Microsoft and Apple and how big they are, but imagine them actually carrying weapons and going to war over all of this. This is just a nice, pretty picture of what North America looked like. And then here we have this great explorer date sponsoring country. That means who's paying for it, where they could be from. You see Christopher Columbus, though, says Spain when he's Italian, but they paid for it. And then what did they discover? Of course, people lived here. You can't discover something people live in, but there that is.